It seems like Andrew Hughes. Michael.
What was that?
Andrew Hughes is already recording.
Okay. Good. Right. So, oh boy, I'm getting a lot of echoes.
James, can you mute?
I thought I was.
Okay. Right. So I put together a little bit of an outline. We can talk about that, see what we think makes sense. I suspect we won't get through all of this. We were thinking of planning this as like a multi-session discussion, but this can be a good kickoff. My thinking in the discussion that we had before is we could start out with a retrospective in terms of, what kind of things went well in the past 10 years, what were the keys to successes, what worked in the management project, what didn't, and then flip over to looking forward in terms of, what should we be doing going forward in terms of making the project successful for the next 10 years. I've kind of outlined the time that we have, which is 2 hours, to say, maybe we should spend around 30 minutes on the retrospective, 70 minutes looking forward, and the last 20 minutes trying to put together some concrete actions. And for each of them, I thought we would start out with a sort of 5 minutes, like a bit of an intro discussion, and then some work together where we not quite putting the stickies on the wall since we don't have that, but in the box document that I've shared, put together what we think was most important to talk about to kick things off. And after that 5 minutes, come back, review that, and decide, exactly what we're going to dive into details on. So doing that both for the retrospective and for the looking forward. Does that sound good to people? I'll take silence as yes.
Yep. Sounds good.
Okay, so let's flip on to start out with the retrospective. The retrospective. So, here I think, we had a few questions that we put together, before. What are the key things we think that made Node successful in the last 10 years? What were the key values that supported that success? And what worked in the management of the project and what didn't? And again, once we agree on these, I was thinking we'd go off and for 5 minutes each type in our thoughts, and then we can come back and sort of see what we've gotten. Are there any other key things like that or questions like that that we should add to the top level list before we dive into that?
Do you want me to set up a fun retro board? Or do you want to do this async?
Yeah, well, so the fun retro board, that would let us paste things onto the board?
Yeah, we could just literally be typing anonymously, adding things to the 3 different areas.
Yeah, that sounds great. I assume there's an easy way to export that. Yeah, great. Just so long as we can paste it back into the doc after, that sounds really good.
And what are the categories? Sorry, Michael.
It's these 3 in the. If you open up the link that I pasted, you can just copy them. Well, Darcy does that. Any other topics, or does that sound good to people? Those 3. And I'm going to start our timer too. We're at 3:10, so okay. We'll go to about 3:40 on this side, roughly. Or I guess I should say 2:10.
Let me know if folks have access to that board.
Where did you pasted it into the chat?
Yeah, I can also paste it into the actual doc.
Yeah, okay. I got a 404. Maybe I copied it wrong though.
Let me see, one sec. Make sure that's sharing. Yeah, anything that you add should be private until you decide to turn everything visible so folks can take some time to add feedback. And then there's also a voting mechanism there too for folks if you
Okay.
want to stack rank feedback.
Okay, I'm still getting 404 with the link you pasted. Is anybody else having any luck? Oh, wait a sec. Now I seem to be able to have gotten to it. Okay. Okay, so let's take 5 minutes. So we'll get back at 3:17 if people can start populating in the things, and then we'll come back to that to discuss. I'm just going to paste the link into there. Remind everybody the 5 minutes is to fill up all 3 sections as opposed to just the first one. So I'll give everybody the 1-minute warning. Okay, so I think it's 3:18. So at this point, we should probably stop for now and flip over to reviewing and looking at what everybody's put in. So Darcy, can you flip the switch?
I'm looking for my mic and my.
Okay, I was gonna wonder, like, is it me that I was just about to look for my mic, but then when you respond, it's like, okay, it's not me.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Yeah, sorry, my computer is also lagging here. There you go. And we can merge like if you want to go through each column, we can
Okay.
merge like-minded cards.
So yeah, why don't we do that? So collaboration, I don't know if other people can help pull things on top too. Like, do we merge or just pull on top? How do we do that?
You can just drag and then merge it, and then
Okay.
say yes, merge. So you can, I think you can drive from here, Michael.
Okay.
If you want.
Yeah, I can see, right, okay.
Did you want to share your screen as well?
Yes, I haven't shared that one. Sorry, let me do that. Stop sharing that one, and I will share.
I think the nice part is
Scott.
like everybody's able to give anonymous feedback, so that's
Yep.
always. Yeah.
No, yeah, that definitely is good. So collaboration, I don't, oops, no, keep it, okay.
Oh yeah, you want to say yes, merge it, yeah.
But I didn't want to. So collaboration, easy adoption, community, transparency, accessibility for beginners, built-ins for common simple scraps, lack of dependency help, package management, big ecosystem that everybody able to use right away. If anybody speak up if you think these match some of the others. Fostering a vibrant and open source ecosystem, productivity when using Node, fast startup, small size, helping first-time contributors and outreach efforts, ease of development for people new to programming, the larger ecosystem, great support the Node runtime by making it easier to use Node.js as opposed to existing established ecosystems such as Java. The adoption of, go ahead.
We could also go through like, so everybody has 6 votes.
Right.
As far as I know. So like everybody could just go through this and then do like a vote, and then we could probably, then we can stack rank the cards, and then you'll see what bubble it's up to the top probably.
Right. Yeah, I was just looking to see if we should merge any of these
Or
first.
something immediately, yeah.
Like does NPM and the larger ecosystem fit together? I don't know. Healthy stability, features.
With symbiotic relationship there, I would say NPM and the larger ecosystem do merge. So feel free to. Yeah.
So we could, anybody object to that? Okay,
Yes,
okay.
You could,
Ecosystem.
I feel like it'd be pretty reasonable to just merge all the things like lack of dependency, help, package management, NPM, ecosystem. Like all that is really just saying dependency management is good.
Okay.
Right?
Everybody agree with that?
I think so. Yeah, in general, that's yeah.
Okay. So I'm just pulling together fostering a vibrant open source ecosystem. Do we think that's, people think that one's the same or different in some way?
Community, I think that's probably like under community. You can put those two together.
Okay, right. Okay.
accessibility for beginners and ease of development can be merged.
Sorry, which one and which one? The
Accessibility for beginners and ease
right.
of development.
Okay. Ease of development. Right. Okay. Easy adoption fit in there too?
That might be that might be separate. Like
Okay.
I don't know. It sounds like there's two sentiments there. Like it's easy to get started, but then adoption could be, I don't know.
I personally see them. I interpret them the same.
Yeah. Okay.
I wrote the easy for beginners one. So if maybe the person who wrote early adoption or easy adoption wants to say whether they think that's different than the other one. No, nobody wants to de-anonymize their.
Okay.
It's good to. Yeah, so you could add that Michael. So easy adoption, add to the accessibility for beginners and ease of development.
Okay. Sure. Okay. Okay, so maybe let's do that for the other ones, and then we'll see how much time we have in terms of coming back to ranking. And in terms of values, so trust in collaborators, prioritizing removing barriers to get in the way of people doing work, hard work by passionate individuals who felt like they had a voice and were given freedom to contribute without fear of making mistakes. Does that fit with trust in collaborators, or welcome? I'm not sure. Escape hatches, guidance instead of punishment, respecting and welcoming new collaborators. JavaScript is the main language in the front end. It's easy for developers to develop things in the back end. Small but useful enough core. Consensus seeking model. Focus on community. Freedom of users to do things that we would not. New features that were originally added very fast to the project make people like that. It was striving ecosystem. Reliable software, very stable, fast to use and easy to use. Ease of welcoming new contributors to the project, and widespread adoption of NPM registry module coupled with open source on GitHub allowed real collaboration. Value being transparency. Not sure if I'd merge any of those really. Any that people think we should merge? Okay, if nobody's speaking up, let's move on to what worked in the management project, what didn't. Working groups to help to break out key concerns. Attempts to coordinate work on larger changes, which did not work too well. Central corporate ownership of the project led to development stalling. So that's obviously a no. LTS release process, formation of the technical steering committee. The generic workload resulted in many stale PRs, and quite a few people who might have wanted to interact more stopped opening a PR due to that. Unanimous consensus leaning towards aggression and conflicts that are seen as uncompromising. Supporting teams, working groups to push forward with autonomy. So I think that might fit into this one. I think we can improve how we handle contentious issues. Good documentation using GitHub as a platform for organizing meeting calls, artifacts of all decisions. Whatever process delayed, promises in core did not work well. That should have been pursued aggressively years earlier. The merger with IO allowing the adoption of a different release cadence and the rapid adoption of newer JavaScript features. The actual IO Node.js version leap itself was a bit of a disaster. I did not really know what was going on. It made it look like the previous governments had been wobbly. Okay, so I think at this point we have, another 15 minutes or so. And it's kind of what's the best way to sort of summarize this into something that will inform what we think we should be doing going forward. I think, in terms of the what worked and what didn't work, there's a few things which are, maybe we should pull it into what didn't work in one area and what did work.
Do you want to, I think I can add an extra column if you want, Michael.
Okay, sure.
Let's see, can I add a column? Is this easy? Can it be done?
While you're looking at that, you know, Michael, one of the things that we might want to do at some point here, I'm not sure how much time we're going to have to do it today or not, but looking at some of the collaborator survey results. Well,
Yeah.
And combine what we find here with that at some point. Like I said, I don't know if we're going to have time to go through it.
I don't think we'll have time today, but I think that you're right that that should be part of this, to go through it and say, what is that telling us in terms of some of these things?
Yeah.
Okay, so what didn't work?
Just changing colors on you here, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
might help. And I also ordered by voting or by rank, so that might help bubble this up. And we can also export this for you to add as we can export it as like CSV, etc.
Yeah, okay, because we'll want to export that and put it into the minutes. I mean, in terms of looking at it, if we look at some of the key themes, just so that we think about them, maybe we can pull those out into the doc. Can I get this into here? So in terms of like, what do we want to keep in mind as we move forward, right? So I think it's like package ecosystem. What else? This one says, I'm just trying to say in terms of the key values, it's kind of like the focus on community, trust in collaborators. Focus on, please type in X other ones if you think they should be different on helping you. And so I guess we might put in here working groups. I'm just trying to put a little bit of a summary there. If other people have thoughts, that just feel free to type them in too. I don't know if would people agree that, some of these point to how we handle larger changes is an area we can think about improving? Or is that stretching? I see how we handle contentious issues. Promises were delayed.
It's almost, like if I was going to compare it to the feedback we got in the Collaborator Summit, the theme more is how can we achieve consensus more efficiently, effectively, or do we need to change how we determine consensus? That tends to be the
I think there might be a bit more detail we could drive in there. it's not just how we reach consensus, it's how we approach situations of deadlock in consensus in particular. With a unanimous consensus model, we basically, when a deadlock occurs, we just let people argue it out for the most part, historically.
Yeah.
I
So
think we
sorry,
need
go
to,
ahead.
I think we need to kind of go into that being a particularly special scenario of our consensus, rather than saying consensus as a whole is problematic.
Okay, so I think we only have 7 more minutes for this initial section, but I think I put on one of the topics for later, like in the second half, looking forward. It seems like consensus seeking would be one of the 6 topics maybe we should dive into some more detail on. Does that make sense to people?
Yeah, it does, and I would note that there is a session on tomorrow's agenda on specifically that topic, by the way.
Yep. So maybe we can consider that, whether we want to duplicate that or not. Because yeah, then the next part we have like a whole list of topics we had as potential things to talk about. We're gonna have to pick a subset. So I'd say let's throw consensus seeking as a candidate there, and then when we get to voting there, we can dive into more details. Any other key things like that we should pull out from this? What worked, didn't work?
In terms of the not working, I unfortunately I can't actually see that list right now. Having some system issues I'm dealing with, but our meetings we're still having some problem getting a really good diversity of folks and participating actively in the meetings. Just if we look at this this call, right, in terms of who's attending, I think we have like maybe 1 or 2 women, and the rest are all guys. Not a great diversity of time zones represented, right? We need to just stop and really rethink our meeting strategy to see if it's really being effective for us or not.
Okay, I've added that in, and that could be a potential meeting approach. Is another candidate for the topics for today. Yeah, it didn't show up in that list, but that's something to definitely think about. I guess like out of this one, it would almost be like if we could come up with we have the key things, so we want to keep doing the things that were successful, maintain the things we think that were the key values which were supported the success, and then figure out how to improve the things which didn't work. So are there any other things like from the our history so far that we really want to focus on in terms of like, hey, we should keep on doing these things, or we should change what's going on this front?
One thing, oh, go ahead.
All right, I'll go. Then you go. I'll make it quick. The one thing that I will point out from the survey results is the one thing that people express the most amount of frustration with is all process-oriented stuff around how we have our conversation. So we've already mentioned this. Talking about how we determine consensus and how we do the meetings. I would have to say that based on everything I've seen there, really the priority comes down to that. Over everything else. I'd really like to see us spend most of our time focusing on those issues.
Okay, and then mine was, there's a couple of comments in there about small but useful core. But I think one of the things that's come up a few times in like the tooling and then in the web server frameworks team is, what is the line? So like some of the great additions are like make derp, like that seems like an awesome addition to core, but that's starting to, you know, stray out of the small core theology. And I think it'd be interesting to see if there's a better way, because there's other things that have, you know, not made it specifically because of that, even though they seem super useful.
Okay. That aligns with one of the topics in here was definitely like, you know, we could probably spend a whole couple hours on small core or not. And
we could spend an hour just talking about the collaborator survey results around small core.
yep.
One thing that, you know, in that report that there absolutely was no consensus on whatsoever, right? In terms of priority and how we're doing on it, you know, it was pretty much even across the board. So.
Yep. Yeah, I know. I think we're split in terms of some people still believe small core. Other people are like, well, no, we should be adding more. And so that's definitely, like, as we look forward, it's probably one of the key things we should talk about. So we're down to 2 minutes for this section. Any other key things people want to call out from having sort of looked at this, thought a little bit about?
And not brought in there either, which is similar to small core in my opinion, is compliance with like browser specifications. This has come up a bunch because of the Deno stuff where people are like, yeah, but look, Deno's trying to like follow as a guiding principle browser specs. And I don't know if we have a statement on that, or I don't see it in there. Like we have, again, good examples of following browsers and good examples of not. So.
Yep. Yep, I added that to the list here just to make sure we've got, no, sorry, that goes down here. Okay, so I think we're at time for this section. So now let's flip over to the next section, which is like looking forward. Now we have this long list of topics, you know, grouped into technical management of the project, building Node.js, dependencies, safety net, key technology trends, Node.js readiness as an enterprise-grade runtime, Node.js in the JavaScript landscape, growing Node.js, and I'd have to look to see where and if the things we just talked about are as well. So there's this list at the top, consensus seeking, how we have our conversations. What I had in mind, and I don't know, like maybe it's too aggressive to try and, you know, do 6 topics in 20 minutes and 10 minutes each, maybe 3 topics in 20 minutes. So I'm, you know, whatever people think makes sense there. But I think now what we want to do is, as sort of a kickoff, pick, you know, some number of topics. We can do it again. We can get Darcy to set up another board. In this case, you know, we'll get people to put in their top ones and rank them, and then vote for the others, and we can figure out what those topics would be. So first of all is like, would people prefer fewer topics with more time? 6 topics or 6 topics, you know, 3 topics at 20 minutes, or say 6 topics at 10 minutes? What do people think makes sense?
I think realistically, 3 topics in 20 minutes is more viable.
Any minuses, plus ones to that? As I looked at it, I was thinking 6 and 10 minutes. We're not gonna have much time to talk about anything. So.
Agree with 20 cents. Sounds reasonable.
Okay. Okay, so let's switch to 20 minutes, 3 topics. So what I would suggest is that, you know, if Darcy, you can set up another board. I think we only need 1 column in this case. And if people can then, you know, once we get that started, we will, if everybody can put in, you know, some number of, you know, whatever number of topics they want along, and then vote on, once we reveal, we'll have everybody vote on the ones that they prefer we start out with, and we'll then dive into those ones. I'm hoping with in the last few minutes, the last 20 minutes of actions, we can include how do we continue these conversations, because obviously we will not have covered everything that we really should talk about in terms of making sure we've got a plan and view of the future.
Just the one column?
I think that will do.
Sure. So I just pasted it in chat. I'll add it to the doc as well.
Okay.
Where's the best place to put it? Topics for today under that?
Yep. Okay, so if everybody can start adding their topics, we'll go for 5 minutes or when everybody says they're done. Is everybody still thinking?
I think I'm done.
Okay, I'll just say 2-minute warning. Okay, maybe one more minute and then we'll get started. Okay, is everybody done? I don't hear any noise, no's, so I guess Darcy, we might as well flip the switch. Okay, if anybody can, everybody now can plus ones there. Status health of resident repos and repo health, are they the same?
I think so.
Okay, so let's merge those. Oops. That work? Hey, repo, no, okay.
Did you want to share your screen?
Yeah, okay, sorry, I'm gonna bring it back in here. Try to anyway, there we go.
Might have to zoom in. Pretty tiny.
Is that any better?
Yeah,
Yeah.
way
A lot better.
Okay. Okay, so if everybody can plus one the ones they would like to. Can you order, I guess we shouldn't give people like say 2 more minutes to cast votes or 1 more minute and then we'll order by priority, by votes there. Okay, so well, let's order by number of votes.
I think you can do that on your screen right there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is this one? No, how do I
We're
do
at the top left. So it says sort order.
right, okay, right. There we go, thanks.
Okay.
Okay, so it looks like we've got key technology trends in Node.js. What gets in does not get into small core and more. And should we have a roadmap priority list as the top, closely followed by community in terms of teaching and showing people how to contribute to core, and then all the rest. So I guess in terms of picking 3, we've got 3 top ones. Oops, no. So which one do we want to start with? I guess why don't we start with the key technology trends in Node.js since that got the most votes. Is there a way I can copy this? If I edit, okay, there we go. So I'm just going to put this here. Okay, so does anybody want to start out with their thoughts on the key technology trends in Node?
I can start with an icebreaker on TypeScript at least. I think that TypeScript is very heavily used in the ecosystem, and it's something we need to definitely support. But due to the nature of TypeScript, I feel very strongly that we should not include the compiler in Node's core. TypeScript does have breaking changes that we historically have been adverse to over its lifetime, and it will continue to have those. Also, we do not have control over parts of the compiler, and you can see that on the TypeScript issue repo that they are not bi-directional at all times in what they're willing to compromise their goals for.
What
If-
does? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I just was gonna ask, what does TypeScript support for Node mean in this context?
Ensuring that the APIs we produce are at least reasonable to their typing system. You can look at other runtimes like Moddable. Some of their APIs are absolutely nonsensical to try to type into TypeScript. Ensuring that we actually have some guidance for the people creating the node type definitions. To my knowledge, we don't really interact with that at all. They also don't consider Node currently to be a runtime target. Node is a library option. Basically, just having better integration with TypeScript's ebb and flow of things. You can see friction that I worry about with that, with things like TypeScript refuses to output a variety of things for the ESM implementation in Node, even though they were part. They also have decorators that they ship that are not compliant with modern decorator proposals that they're not going to remove. So we know that that'll be a breaking change in the future. And those are the kinds of things that make me wary of ever including the compiler itself in. Yeah.
I wanted to add as well. I mean, TypeScript is both incapable at the moment of fully typing all JavaScript values, and also there are very kind of fundamental inaccuracies in the way it tries to type JavaScript that it would be very concerning to me if Node, like it's totally fine if Node is trying to make sure that TypeScript users have a good experience in Node. That is fine. But if Node in any way sort of commits to TypeScript, then it concerns me, because TypeScript doesn't, like, it isn't a subset of JavaScript. It isn't actually accurately typing JavaScript, and like, although these things are arguably bugs, like, and until they're fixed, you know, or like some of them aren't planned to be fixed. In other words, like, you can't have symbols as property keys, for example, like as indexable property keys and things like that. So I think there's a very large difference between what I think Bradley's suggesting, which was what he said, Bradley, about the, like, making sure the APIs work well, and between, let's say, including the compiler in core.
Right, or even including the types, because I remember an issue where there was some discussion about integrating the types, and my take from the people in the TypeScript community is they weren't even necessarily saying that was a great idea.
Right. And I mean, the other thing is, which version of TypeScript do the types support? Because if you're going to use unknown, if you're going to support TypeScript 3.8 or whatever, you can't use predicates or you know, whatever the, like, exact version those things were released in. But it's like, it would be Node has to retain compatibility with the current version of TypeScript after, let's say, 4 versions later, when they finally fix some of these major flaws and it's really important, then like upgrading the types would then become a breaking change. And that is one of the primary reasons why I think it's a bad idea for packages to ship their own types, because like it's really hard to define semver around 2 surfaces, the value space and the type space. And Node already, I don't know if the word is struggles, but already puts a lot of effort into defining how semver applies to Node's APIs. To have to not just duplicate that effort for the types, but also figure out how the 2 of those interoperate seems like an intractable problem.
So I don't think we have time to dive into each technology in depth. I wonder on the TypeScript front of how many people would say that it's important to the success as we go forward for the next 10 years of Node to figure out the Node's TypeScript story, what we should be doing, and like is it that like I suggested, it's like, hey, we are going to focus on making sure that people using TypeScript have a good experience, or on the other hand, it could be like, hey, we should integrate or whatever. But how many people think it's important for us as a project to figure that out in terms of our future?
I think it's critical that we, at the very least, have a definition about what we mean when we say Node has TypeScript support. What is the scope of that? What is the limit of that? Right. And it at least gives us a way of framing a conversation. If somebody comes to us and say, hey, add TypeScript support or do this or do that, it gives us some bound where we can say, yeah, that's something where, that belongs in core versus this is something that doesn't. Right now we have the whole conversation feels very vague and nebulous, and there's very little, and the boundaries of all this are very fuzzy about what exactly does TypeScript support in Node actually mean. So we have to clarify that before we can move on to say what are we specifically.
Right. I think what I hear is like, we've got to figure out the Node TypeScript story, which could be anything from nothing to like, I don't think there's one answer to what you just said, but I think we should come up with what we think the right answer is. Is that fair?
Yeah, I'd say that's fair.
Okay. Any like, again, it's just trying to say, like, if we put a list of things that are like key for the next 10 years of success, do we have consensus that we should include, say, figuring out the TypeScript story would be one of those things?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
It is very important, especially since the Node success story is probably also about adopting new features fast and at an early stage originally. And it's definitely going to be challenging if we decide to support TypeScript properly, but it might be a key success factor.
Okay.
So my key about why I didn't want to include the compiler is whatever support matrix we have for TypeScript, we need to beware of what forwards incompatibilities we are adopting. So TypeScript has known forwards incompatibilities like decorators. That whenever decorators land in JavaScript, the language itself, they will not work how they work in TypeScript.
Right. Okay. I think that's part of diving into what is our story, right? Like,
so for all these technologies, it's the same thing for me, though. I don't think it's specific to TypeScript. It's about these forwards incompatibilities. I want to adopt as much as we can.
So that can be key here. Key elements. Forward incompatibility. So what would be the next key technology trend that people would want to spend a few minutes talking about or highlight? I'd throw out WASM. What do people think in terms of how important is it that Node acts as a WASM runtime, figures out how to interoperate well with it?
I think it's very important. There's a lot of churn going on in the WebAssembly ecosystem right now to figure out sort of how everything works in it. But overall, we're seeing these sort of trends towards how people package their their binary releases of various to run in WebAssembly. And if we as Node support WebAssembly, both as with standards like WASI, which is something we're working on, but if we support that and we have our own our own APIs like NAPI integrated into that, we can start to really integrate Node, or I should say things can integrate into Node that would not previously have been possible, or just like you could start to sort of plug and play Node with lots of other things that you would not normally do, which I think makes it powerful in terms of being able to really extend Node and use it in different environments.
It certainly reflects my thinking. Anybody else have comments, thoughts?
So WASM has some interesting advantages. So we've spent a lot of time porting C++ code to JavaScript. And that generally comes with performance or garbage collection penalties doing so. I would be very much on the side of we need to take a serious look at having built-in modules written in WASM. Some of the defensive coding styles we've started to adopt are tedious and could be worked around if we used WASM.
Other people's thoughts?
I still prefer as much of Node as possible to be written in JavaScript, but I would much rather see WASM than C++. And it seems like an important standard to support, especially given that it's going to ship in browsers alongside JavaScript and be equally usable at some point. It seems like it's pretty critical that Node have just the same amount of usability around WASM that browsers do.
So one thing that I'm not familiar with WASI, what extensively are browser implementations?
James, can you speak up a little louder?
Sorry, I'm thinking about WASI specifically. How extensive have browsers committed to implementing WASI support?
WASI is sort of okay. So WASI is not a monolithic API. It's broken up into chunks that like different can support. So like your Linux kernel running WASI might have like networking, or your watch might have Bluetooth. So like browsers are committed to shipping certain parts of WASI in that sense.
I think the important part for WASI is there's some stuff about how permissions and bindings are automatically injected when you instantiate a module. Everybody doing WASI has the same kind of basic template for that. Also, WASI has a specific FFI model being introduced called interface types. And that affects things like running a WebAssembly binary. directly. So I think those are all agreed upon by browsers.
Just to clarify also, interface types isn't specific to WASI, it's just a extension to WASM in general. So we should be able to get that for free just because V8 will support it.
To my knowledge though, Gus, we still have to create those interfaces
Yeah,
for the coercion.
We do, but.
Okay, so I guess again, do we think WASM's an important thing that we need to focus on, like a node, figuring out our node story for?
I mean, if TypeScript is WASM, definitely is. I would put them in a similar bucket, but personally, I would rank WASM way higher than TypeScript.
Okay.
In terms of priority.
I would change the priority order. I personally believe that WASM is important for the next 10 years, definitely, but it's not going to have as widespread usage as TypeScript is. TypeScript is just a basic thing that everyone wants to run, and they don't want to think about it anymore. They just want to start up the application and have something running.
Okay, I don't think we need to argue at this level the priority. I think
I would add one other thing to WASM
yeah.
here is how it relates to our native add-ons story. I know we have the thing about integration with an API, but there's been a lot of expressed interest in basically being able to use WASM or WebAssembly modules to replace native add-ons entirely.
Yeah, I think that may be a longer term thing than a shorter term thing. Everybody who's looked at it has said you can only do a subset with WASM that you can do with current modules, native modules.
Yep.
But longer term, if that's what I'd really like to see is a path where you can basically build your add-on using the same tools. And if you're doing something that's a WASM that is the subset that will run under WASM, you can compile it as WASM and it works. Or if it's something that you need to run as a like WASM can't do, then you can build it as an API add-on and it works. And if that line changes, you can simply recompile it and now it's a WASM module, right? But I think at this point we should spend our last few minutes on, those are two good examples of things that I think we see are important. What are the other things in terms of the trends that we should be focusing on?
The thing that keeps coming up over and over and over again is stuff like fetch, browser, supporting browser APIs. So what WG streams, fetch, file, and blob. These things keep coming up over and over and over. There's obviously a tremendous amount of interest in fetch.
It might also be useful to look at browser APIs and decide if there is a possible core subset that both browsers and Node could share. Because like fetch itself, like there's like as an example, deals with cookies and the current URL and all sorts of stuff that just concepts that don't exist in Node. But 90% of fetch or whatever the number is works just great in Node. And so like it would be great if there was some common subset that the browsers in Node could all have, and then fetch would be the browser part and Node would have the common thing.
Right. Yeah, and this, so we break that down in terms of, okay, what are the core components of fetch that are needed to enable it without actually going all the way? So things like event target, which we just landed, abort controller, file, blob, right? These things are all primitives that could exist in Node that don't, that are definitely very relevant to Node. Whereas, a fetch implementation could easily be user land implemented on top of these core pieces in Node. So.
Right. So
the more important thing is
go ahead.
WebSockets. WebSockets was a frequently asked feature that we do not support yet.
So I think this sounds like I think, James, tell me if I'm characterizing it wrong, but like, again, like a key success factor could be figuring out and defining our like Node's approach to supporting browser APIs.
Yeah.
Like it shouldn't be that we should have a plan that says, okay, there's browser APIs. Yes, we think it's really important to be compatible. If so, what are we doing so that like when new APIs come out, do we try and keep track of those, or what do we do to make sure we're successful on that front?
Right. Yep.
When it comes to that, maybe like faster adoption than what we do mostly otherwise. So with event target, I believe we are quite fast. But when it comes to example fetch or WebSockets, it's a very long ongoing discussion without actually finding any solution or consensus on it. And that probably will drive away people at some point, or might drive them away.
Right. Okay. Any others like that are top of people's minds in terms of like success factors, like key technologies that, you know, it's important that we figure out and have define the Node story for?
So I would actually move WebSockets out to a separate category that, you know, just kind of networking and network standards. I would put WebSockets there. I would put the ongoing work around Quick, right? I mean, Quick is progressing, but it's still something, there's still a lot to do. You know, so, you know, we definitely need to be looking at those and coming up with a strategy. So.
I think I would agree in that was sort of like one of the fundamental, it was fundamental, I think, to the success in the first 10 years and probably is going forward too, right?
Yeah.
Any others like that? Go ahead.
I would say one of the key themes with the networking standards is I want to, we really have to avoid having to have a new surface area, API surface area for every web protocol. And having HTTP1 API, HTTP2 API, I'm dreading any possibility of having to have an HTTP3 API. And the reason we've had to have these separate is because the implementation of the protocol has always been intertwined with the implementation of the API around the protocol, and it was breaking change to separate those, but it makes it very difficult to maintain and get correct. So we really have to figure something out with API surface area around these network protocols.
Right. Okay.
And there is a discussion on scheduled for tomorrow afternoon, by the way, to discuss that.
Okay. So we're almost, I think, at the time for this topic. Any other particular ones that are top of people's minds that?
So in general, we've seen an increase in static or ahead of time tooling for JavaScript. Even like new browser standards where they're always touted as doing things kind of in flexible ways, you just write it without a tool, are starting to adopt things like import maps. People are using tools like TypeScript, the things that compile the WASM for Node. We don't really have a support story for what people can do ahead of time with Node. To some extent, we tried to design policies and loaders so that you could analyze them ahead of time, but a lot of our APIs are not things that are static at runtime. We allow people to add or remove hooks in various locations. And so these static tools can't rely on any data that we produce about those. So you end up with things like Webpack's magic chunk comments, which isn't great. But as we see more and more static tooling, we need to just be mindful of the flexibility we give people what people come to us for might change over these next 10 years. 10 years is a long time.
Yeah, okay.
For the next years, also, we should strive for simplicity in all our APIs. Sometimes Node APIs tend to be more complex. It's often historical. And yeah, now we should, for example, focus more on the promise APIs to implement them everywhere so that people are able to use them right away instead of having to promissify things on their own. Most people do not even know about our utility function.
Right. So would it be a success factor to basically have a, you know, a full promise-based API that, you know, you could use on its own?
That would be a success factor out of my perspective, yeah.
Anybody have concerns with that? Agree? Okay, well, I think we should move on to,
better,
go ahead.
better debugging experience with FS. This is a long ongoing thing, but we do not have stack traces for the Async API. And it should be that simple. You know, sometimes we discuss things in the diagnostic working group and try to figure out complex situations, but this is way too complex for 98% of all developers who use Node. And it would be great to reach maybe, let's say, 50% of the developers. And to do so, it has to be really, really simple. And it should just be there pretty much. It should just work. Similar to using async await, where you get a good stack trace. But
Yeah, I would agree that the diagnostics is an important area still to push the key success story too. Okay, I think unfortunately we got to move to the next section, but we could, you know, I think we can capture this and we should come back and continue this sort of planning for what we think. And I think each one of these almost needs a deep dive. But the next topic was what does not get in small core. Somebody want to kick that one off?
I think we should swap the priorities of those two next topics. Okay,
I think, so should we have a we have a roadmap first? Okay, sure. I think they're related in some sense, so I agree. Any good concerns with swapping around the priority there? Okay, if not, does anybody want to kick off discussion on this one?
So the web has a thing actually under HTML design principles, which I would love if we could adopt. I'm going to put the link here and in the doc. In particular, it has something called the priority of constituencies. Ooh, words. Which basically gives a hierarchy of design priorities. So I just want to read it for a sec. It'll only take a minute. In the case of conflict, prioritize users over authors, over implementers, over specifiers, over purity. And so we don't really have any such thing. This is like one sentence that I think Node would benefit greatly from adopting over the next 10 years, figuring out what our actual priorities are. We often come into conflicts of people stating things are performance problems, but benefit users. And we also come into things where we reject features because it affects a benchmark in a way that might be odd, I would say. We don't have any guidance, even for collaborators like myself. I've been around, 10-ish years almost. And we still face problems of this nature. Like we had an issue, a PR thread about moving loaders into a thread, and we simply don't have any sort of technical document that we can refer to or any method to produce design decisions that can be referenced later. We just kind of point to old PRs. And so there's no central place to have a guiding principle. And so we get into conflict in those PRs about, does that design principle stand or not? So I want to see this.
I think I'd add to that, like there's been some discussion recently around like, how do we avoid duplicate effort? And, I think related also like larger changes, people can invest a lot of time and then, people come up with like concerns, complaints, and like, I think that kind of fits together. The first part, like you said, I think is a little bit separate, and a great idea in terms of like, here's our principles. But I think it kind of bleeds almost a little bit into then, and these are maybe all a little tangential to a roadmap, but like, how do we do larger chunks of work changes in a visible and transparent way versus, like, I think today it's often you come up with a large chunk of code, but by that time, there's been a lot of investment, so it's hard to change, and it's possibly hard to consume as well. I don't know what people's thoughts are on that front.
So in particular, I want us to kind of have guiding principles, maybe not necessarily a hierarchy of needs, but we have things like what users should be able to have as a guarantee. We have people monkey patching core for good or bad. It doesn't really say anything about them. They're doing it for their own personal needs, but we have implicit contracts by, ordering the FS calls of how CommonJS work that the ecosystem now depends upon. And we have no design principles stating that that is a safe thing to do. And we also don't have something stating that they should not do that. I mean, it's pretty much, if you can do it, it's implicitly endorsed by Node right now. And it would be great to just have a document that says, like, you can be assured of these things and you should not do these things.
Any thoughts from other people?
I definitely agree.
I really hope Node adopts these principles. I think, like officially, I think it would be a very good thing. And to Michael, I think you were talking about like legacy code and stuff. And to me, that falls into the users part of the constituencies, right? It's existing users that are using existing APIs are the top priority, even if those APIs are not good for the rest of the constituencies. Like I think it's a really good framework to help decide what to do, both for supporting like old stuff and also new stuff.
But this also leads into a roadmap when we're talking about users. When we have guidance of who we're trying to serve with PRs in core, we aren't just adding APIs that add new features to core. Sometimes we're trying to make APIs that make users have a more enjoyable experience. or a more bug-free experience with Node. Currently, when we try to prioritize things, part of the issues we get into is we don't have an underlying roadmap of what we are trying to accomplish at the macro level. We're always at the PR level with this code, like you were saying. You come in with a PR, you've already done work just to get the PR out there, and then people are only viewing it at the macro level, at the implementation, not as an overall design story of, oh, if we add this, that leads towards something else. So we did this with a Bork controller really well, I think. We added a Bork controller with an underlying expectation that we would be using it in other APIs. And we simply, for some utilities, aren't going to have that. Like, if you're trying to make a better diagnostic or debugging experience, you're going to be adding a lot of ad hoc utility functions that on their own may just be discrete and not interact with each other. And merging one PR for a utility function is a quick way to kind of get shot down in core. Because you have to prove that, oh, this utility function stands on it with the kind of small core concern we have, which is legitimate, but at the same time, that's kind of makes it hard to ever do anything except in a massive PR, which nobody wants to review a PR with like 50 files.
Right. I think maybe you, like, we also might be getting to some terminology here in that I'm starting to see where you're getting at now, in that our roadmap need not be, we want to put in feature X, feature Y. It's more of a, these are what we think is important. It's important to improve, the debuggability / diagnostic sides of things. It's important to, make, if we decided this, provide a good experience for TypeScript users. And then you can tie individual PRs to one of those. And if it's in support of that, then it's more aligned than if it's not aligned with one of those things. Is that?
Exactly. And it also gives kind of a solution to a problem I see sometimes with these smaller PRs. If you introduce a small feature, it's often pushed out to userland, and pushing things out to userland means that they aren't available to all the people in core, and core can't utilize that functionality either, or recommend it even in our docs. We don't recommend you use these ecosystem modules, which people rely on so much.
Yeah, a good example of that, I think, is async local storage finally landing. Like forever, we had async hooks as like the thing that most like APM vendors relied on. Like, there's a lot of things built on top of async hooks that async hooks doesn't actually provide an API at the level that any of the users of the API actually want. Like, almost every user of async hooks actually wants async local storage or something like that. But because of the small core philosophy, like, and the like intense focus on like everything's got to be like the best performance possible, like I agree, like trying to have the best performance you can is good, and like to an extent I agree in the small core idea, but I also feel that delivering half an API doesn't actually help anyone. It just makes things worse. It's like, I think you kind of have to like figure out what do the users actually need, and figure out, well, can this be fully implemented in user land? If so, then let them do that. If it needs to be implemented in core, then do that. There's some cases where like async local storage in its current design could be implemented purely in user land, using the async hook stuff. But the async hooks stuff and like all the stuff around that is kind of terrible to use directly. Having that integrated into core just functions a lot better, and there's a lot more opportunity for it to be optimized. Like it's currently layered on top of async hooks, but we could swap out a bunch of the internals of async local storage to make it more deeply integrated, make it like better performing API, because it being layered on top of async hooks is just an implementation detail now.
Right,
Whereas
and
if
I'm not sure we're comfortable exposing the lower level details.
Yep. Yeah, the lower level details, like what is in async hooks, in my opinion, should never come out of experimental. Whereas async local storage, I think it's fine for it to come out of experimental because it's not exposing anything internal.
With that, we don't really have a policy. We've got to figure this out. How do we bring one thing out of experimental if it's based on another thing that is experimental? Because our guarantee, or the thing with the experimental is we could decide to pull that entirely at any point in time, and there are no Semper guarantees. So we would have to, if suddenly we unexperimentalized something, and then suddenly we have to completely change the thing it's based on, right? We're introducing a Semper major change, and we're completely changing what we mean by experimental. We have to be very careful with that.
I think it's like, if we say an API is non-experimental, the fact that it relies on things that are experimental now becomes our problem. Right? Like we can't say, oh, sorry, it relies on something that was experimental, therefore, it's like, we're like saying if we get rid of async hooks because they were experimental, we'd need to find that other implementation.
Yeah. But to me, the important thing is that async local storage is simple enough API surface area, and we understand it well enough that we can fairly confidently say that if we decided to rip out async, we would know how to re-implement the API at a different level. Whereas async hooks, there's like so many edge cases and like timing peculiarities and all sorts of things like that there's no way we would be able to re-implement async hooks if we decided to rip out all of the internals of it. Like all of the C++ stuff, if we decided to rip that out and fully replace that with something else. That is an enormous, complicated project.
So I think, again, we're running out of time, so we should probably move on to the next topic. But it sounds like putting together, from this discussion, it sounds like there's interest in trying to put together, possibly putting together a roadmap, but the roadmap not being what people might think is a roadmap, but more like here are the things we think are important to the success going forward. So, for example, we believe we need to work on X, Y, and Z in Node to be successful going forward. Is that a fair? Go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry, I just missed that last comment.
Just less roadmap, more wish list.
Or I don't know if I'd characterize as wish list as more as a
I think it's more areas of improvement than specific APIs.
Right.
It's a guide
strategic areas, I guess, is
that aren't making any specific commitment to, yes, this feature is to be released by this time.
Right. Maybe strategic investment areas, like these are areas we think it's important to invest in. It could be things like problem determination, debuggability. It could be things like, compatibility with web standards. But it's kind of like you were saying, it gives us some ways to weigh off some of the trade-offs we have to make.
I'll add one just right off the top of the bat. Our trace event mechanism in core is abysmal. The implementation's always been kind of half done.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, we have user line code that's relying on it on what's there, but it's never been great. It's never had great performance. It's always had all kinds of issues. For instance, right now there's an abort that happens if you are using worker threads and stuff gets thrown out there. I mean, there's all kinds of thread safety issues there. The whole thing needs to be completely redone. So that's one thing we absolutely need some investment in.
Yeah. So that, I mean, that sounds like more of a, like, here's a specific thing that fits under, we need to improve our diagnostic capabilities. If we're looking at sort of that sort of high level, here's our themes, and then you can slot in specific things to those themes that when people have time, like those things take somebody as a champion to push forward, right? But we could probably agree on the themes without having to have people committed to do each one of them.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that was good discussion. We'll and give some thoughts for how we move forward on that. The last one we want to try and talk about today was what gets in, does not get into small core. I think it's kind of a nice follow-on from the previous discussion. Who wants to kick that one off?
Well, I mentioned it originally, and I had a couple of things that I was thinking of specifically. We've had a couple of conversations in the Web Server Frameworks team about APIs that are present in all the frameworks and whether those should be brought into core. And there's been a bunch of pros and cons listed, which I think are valid. You know, if we move it into core, then that means there needs to be people available to support it. Performance concerns, a whole bunch of things like that. But in the end, if every single framework needs to do it on their own, and there's reasons why those don't always end up being shared implementations. Sometimes they do, but a lot of times they don't. It just seems like we're basically telling users, you can't use just the HTTP module. Like in order to implement anything real, you still have to go and use a framework. So at that point, why are we not just considering up-leveling all of that straight into core and giving them an API that's a little bit higher level that they can actually use without the full framework wrapper?
I guess how many people would do that? Like, would the frameworks all still exist? And then how many people would use one versus the other?
So part of the discussion was the idea there would be limited only to things that are very specifically common shared things that are usually spec compliance reasons, right? Like you don't need 7 spec compliant ways to implement setting cookies, right? Like if we had a API in HTTP that was spec compliant for setting cookies, then all the frameworks would still have their sugar and their different ways of, you know, having a higher level API, but they could all delete all of that code they've written themselves and then transition over to depending on the core version, right? Like there's a lot of sugar methods on Express that just, it's what everybody wants. You know, they're present in Fastify, they're present in Express, they're present in Restify. Like, why are they not just the HTTP API in core?
I guess where I was kind of going to though is when we say user, maybe it comes to who are the users, because like if all the users are going to use the frameworks, it doesn't actually, moving them doesn't help them, it helps the framework maintainers. Not saying that's a bad thing, but just saying it's a different thing.
Okay, so the users it would help would be the ones who don't want to use a framework. So the world we have today is we tell everybody, you basically have to use a framework to do anything in a real HTTP server, right? You know, the core thing doesn't even give you like setting content length, like things that are required to be spec compliant, right? Like you have to handle all of that yourself. If we up-leveled the HTTP API a little bit to be more like what Fastify and Express provide for you out of the box, then the benefit would be to the users who don't, for whatever reason, want the full kit and caboodle that comes along with a framework, but still want something that they can functionally build on top of, right? So it'd be changing the user base a bit.
I plus one that, especially sometimes maybe people do not want to have to think about which framework they have to choose. You know, this is actually a really difficult decision for a lot of developers. So taking that decision from them and giving them at least a basic framework or a basic thing that they can work with for the average cases, that would be great. And this applies not only to web frameworks. So we have very, very low level file system APIs. We do add new ones at the moment, but they do not tend to be user friendly all the time. And for example, we add another option, something like that. People do not know what options we have. And it would be great to have a specific, I don't know, like area of APIs that are more high level instead of our low level ones. Most people would probably care about those most and not use the low level ones. Those are mainly for specific implementers who want to build even more powerful APIs on top of that.
That topic has been brought up in the tooling working group a few times, and it's why, for example, Make Derp exists, right? Is because that's what everybody wants. Like, people use FS Extra or, you know, all of these patch libraries because they just want to copy a whole directory, right? Like,
yeah, absolutely.
So that's why we add copy whole directory. Like, that's a great addition.
And they actually also download like gigabytes over the months with all these modules, and while they often only want to have a very tiny subset of features that those provide.
Now, at the same time, though, we have modules out there that are downloaded, you know, millions of times, like is Windows. When we already have in core, you can just do, you know, check to see if you're running on Windows with an existing API. So just because we have an API in core that does something doesn't mean the ecosystem is going to make use of it. Not, you have to keep that in mind as well.
That's
so this is a topic.
Point. Oh. And this is something I discussed with a couple of people before as well. Also in the release working group. So one thing we have not done well so far is to provide documentation that is accessible for everyone, that is understandable to everyone, and that is also found by the Google search engine. And the last point is probably the worst one, because most people still end up on Stack Overflow with examples, and that's why they do not know that things in core already support this out of the box. So documentation is a very big point, and also changelogs. Our changelogs, we are starting to change that so that they are really well readable by anyone pretty much, to provide examples from the changed APIs, the new features. And this is something we should focus on more so that people know about those changes. If I talk to developers whom I work with about new features, they have no idea that they exist.
And so one comment on the many of these packages that have millions of downloads, but have corresponding core APIs. Part of that work, I think, is just working with the community of maintainers. Like, this is where I think having some outreach, because I bet you any money, it's not people directly, it's not end users directly depending on his Windows. It's a framework depending on his Windows and shipping that to all of their users, right? It could be Webpack somewhere way down. And all we really need to do is just talk to the people who maintain the transitive underneath Webpack and say, look, you know, let's start moving people now. You've dropped support for the version that didn't have it, but we're not actively doing that, right? In most of these cases.
look at the top 100 most downloaded NPM modules, and probably most of them should actually just be in core.
Other than Lodash. Sorry, just kidding.
Other than Lodash.
Is
Right.
the major selling points of having things in core versus having just sort of an officially supported library is just having the notion of a de facto way of doing something for users who aren't in the know?
So no, in particular, there's the ability to like make a convention or comply to a spec better. So a great example of this is I have a forever standing PR to get a MIME parser into Node's core, because if you try to actually parse content type and you use all the libraries that frameworks use, they don't actually parse MIME according to the spec for whatever reason. And you can try to convince the frameworks to, you know, adopt an entirely new implementation, but they're not going to. Because I mean, they've been using the same implementation forever. Same with cookies, same with all these things. If you actually have a central point where the ecosystem of framework authors and people not using frameworks can like standardize some API, which for us, unfortunately, is core itself, you get the ability to kind of have people reliably do things across different frameworks, across all usages of Node. Right now, if you pick up a book about Node, like Node in Action, which I had a part of, we had to pick specific modules on how to do things, and some frameworks do not use those modules. So people using those frameworks, those chapters are worthless to them.
I think this like, and that's not even the reason that that argument that actually gets things into core often. I mean, often it's by doing a native implementation, you can implement it better integrated versus non-integrated. Or if you can do it, but it requires native code, which then brings along with it all the challenges around, you know, compiling and having to have the compilers. Those seem to be some of the you know, arguments that convince people. The choosing a de facto one hasn't been one that so far has been really on the radar all that much, I don't think.
It definitely hasn't in the discussions, and I think that's part of the problem I'm trying to point out here is just because it has a technical reason or not shouldn't be the only quality we judge them based off of. User experience is incredibly important, and if we can get a user experience, or maybe I should say developer experience, right? That people don't need to go and choose that module because they are not qualified to make that decision in most cases, right? Like when we're talking about, does it properly support range requests or something? Like an end user should never be making that decision. But today, if they're trying to use HTTP directly, the Node Core version, they have to, right? And that's where I think we could make a clear statement that if it is part of a standard that you know, an HTTP spec standard or something like that, and it is widely deployed currently in frameworks, and it provides better user experience, even if it's not made better by being in core and has a perfectly viable user land experience, I still think it's worth considering bringing those things in and having a more open opinion on that.
Right, and I think that leads into, like Dominika said, posted in the chat, like, is there a case for some userland modules to graduate? I don't know, like related could be like the JavaScript effort to have, say, a JavaScript standard library. Like you could draw the line between being in core itself versus being part of the standard library that Node provides too.
Right. And if we say standard library, it is also important to make a distinction between something that is in lib, right, which is part of our core implementation, versus something that is a vendored in a vendored in dependency. What we could say here is, if you know, for these things that are part of this standard lib, right, they are managed as a separate project. They're not necessarily covered by Node's Semver, or in we're not necessarily going to make these changes in core, but we will vendor them in and make them available through a require as part of standard live. So they're still external projects, but we're essentially blessing them. And what would be the criteria for us to do that?
Right. There's actually a whole bunch of different ways we could implement that, right? Like we could offer a standard library from the Node project that actually isn't shipped with the core binaries.
Right. Readable stream is an example of that. Yeah.
You know, if you did that in a way, you could probably give all that credibility and removing, you know, you don't need to choose. You just use the one that's in the standard library without having to actually increase the binary size.
Right. I'm curious if there's been a discussion around like publishing under like an @scope.js scope name.
It's come up we've never really settled on it, but if we do go the direction of having a blessed standard lib, then I think we would absolutely should go that direction.
We've been working under the package for the package maintenance team, the PKG.js org, which we've now gotten at least a draft for a charter, and we'll be publishing things under that org. One thing that we need to make very clear with that is we did extra work to make sure it was under the guidance of the TSC. So even though it's in a separate GitHub org, it still follows all of the same governance things. And I think that's one benefit that hasn't been talked about yet, which specifically I'm interested in, is moving, like if we move things from Express ownership under the Node org, I think it would open up the contributor base a lot more than it is under the current Express, the way we structure contributions and stuff like that. And I think that's another big benefit, that sort of a paved path.
Yeah, I agree. Like that's another area where, like, it's a more sort of open level playing field that if you bring it in there, more people would probably feel comfortable getting involved or be able to. Unfortunately, I think we only have 5 minutes left. I think that's that whole small core, but I think it's good to expand the discussion in terms of it's not just what gets in or out on the technical basis. It's like, what should be this, what's the problem we're trying to solve, right? Which is, I think we've talked about a few things that are potentially solved by putting them in core, but there are other ways. And it's coming to like, what should we be doing as a project to solve that problem? You know, possibly it's documenting that, you know, one of the reasons for pulling them in is to pull it into core, but it could be things like the standard library or something else.
I think one thing we might love, as part of that last comment of potentially having more open source, help from the community if it's brought under a larger umbrella, is that larger projects are a lot more intimidating for new contributors to enter into. So it may actually have the opposite effect.
Yeah, and I think that's a strong argument for not actually bringing it under the main core umbrella. If we maintain them as separate pieces brought together under kind of a common standard lib umbrella, they can still be managed as small individual projects where people jump in and contribute to in small pieces. It's hopefully far less intimidating than coming into Node master, right, and dropping something in there.
Right, it definitely wouldn't have to be in master. It could be in like we've created the PKGS org, we could create the Node STD repo, and then each piece could have its own sort of repo and governance and that kind of stuff.
And that feels like a better balance to me. Cause like there is a bunch of projects that, like, I feel like don't necessarily need to be like in core in the sense that it's like in the binary, but have a problem of someone like if something is in Node core, there's a certain level of trust in it. Whereas if something's like out in the ecosystem, it's who knows what it is. Like a good example of that is like UUID modules. Like there's hundreds of them. Most of them are terrible. If we had like just one UUID module, it was like this is the good one that's like actually spec compliant, use this, then people could just reach for that. And like there's tons of stuff that tries to use UUIDs. There's tons of apps out there that just grab whatever package, and yeah, because a lot of them are so bad. Like there's like major issues that some of them have, like cryptographic instability and like all sorts of things like that, which can cause like lots of problems in your app.
I very much plus one that as well. So when it comes to that, UIDs are actually not, you don't need a lot of code to implement them. That's why there is often the argument that it could be in userland, but finding the right one is a really tough thing to do. And we often have a lot of the utility functions in core that are exposed as a separate module, again, in userland multiple times. And we could just go ahead and expose a lot of small utility functions from core that we have right now, and could just check what is actually useful for people.
So unfortunately, I think we're at our time. It was a great discussion. I think we should continue on. In fact, we went a little bit past. I'm not sure we have time for next actions, too many specific next actions. But I'm hoping that everybody who here was in, I think we had a really good conversation. We should set up a time to continue this discussion. And, maybe the first thing we should do is actually regroup on some of those next actions, and at the high level figure out, get some people who are interested in pushing forward on some of the things we've already talked, in addition to getting into some of the other areas. Does that sound reasonable to everybody?
Yep.
Okay, so I'll take the action to schedule the follow-on. Probably try and set up for something like maybe, did everybody think like this 2 hours was a pretty reasonable time frame for discussion?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
so I'll try and set up another follow-on session for 2 hours. Put a little bit of the recap. I think some of these things we can start shaping into, some ideas of what we might, in terms those themes we should put together and so forth. So I might try a cut at that, and hopefully everybody can help to then craft it from there. Okay, well, thanks. I guess, with that, I'd say thanks to everybody spending the time, and looking forward to continuing on with this. I think we got some very good challenges there that we should be working on, and hoping we can all come together to push them forward.
Okay. Thanks for facilitating.
Yep. Thanks. Talk to everybody later. Darcy, is Darcy still here?
Yep.
I see you pulled in the second one in terms of like the full list, right? For the first one, is there an easy export that we can?
I linked the spreadsheet, so if you click on that, it should be a spreadsheet that you can grab quickly.
Excellent. Okay, so we can just leave that in there, and like that spreadsheet will stick around, right?
Yeah,
okay.
Everybody has access to it.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, thanks.
No problem.
Talk to everybody later.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.